let's talk about how architecture and the built space environment shapes emotions of people. How do you approach that?
Well, so I think what's very important to understand is if you want to design buildings, you need to do it from the inside out, because that is where people get connected with their immediate environment. Right? A building is a little bit of an abstract thing for many people, but once they get into spaces and they're going to use it, they can feel comfortable, they can feel at place, it works for them or it doesn't work for them. So I think when you really start to talk about creating architecture that works for the people, you need to think from the inside out. You need to think about the life, what's happening inside, what do you want them to experience, how can they feel at place, at home, etc. Right. Before you even start to think about the buildings, because the buildings is a much more abstract way, and we just have to make sure that to some extent it expresses what's happening inside, and it connects to an architectural context.
What's different about how people use space in Europe versus United States? Like, what have you observed on that? Any rules or kind of trends you've observed?
I think Europe is much more pedestrian focused,
focused,
and less car focused. And as a result, I think public spaces are designed more naturally, maybe more refined in a way than what you would find here to some extent. And because it's more pedestrian focused, bicycle focused, etc., there's more people out there on the streets that can encounter into each other, and it calls for more public spaces, in the public realm where people can meet and interact and so on. And that is probably by tradition, right? By history. I mean, we already had the piazzas, in Italy and Greece and so on, all throughout Europe. So it's very much in our DNA.
Yeah.
Create public spaces where people meet and interact. And in the US, at one point, public spaces became the shopping malls, right? And I think we're now getting back here in the US to creating. And there's a lot of effort being done in creating good green spaces, outdoor spaces where people can meet and interact. So and cars, you're getting more and more car-free zones, etc.
When we look at Europe, and there's a ton of history there, right? So like a lot of what you're talking about right now is just informed by the fact that there's hundreds and hundreds of years of history and layering, and that responds, right? There's emotion in that there, right? Because community, life, all these things are over time. It takes time to build this, right? Yeah. If you're not looking at like a historic place like Amsterdam, but if I go South Holland or Belgium or outside of Denmark, what I've noticed in Europe is like those towns are pretty crappy too. Like I'm saying, in terms of like they're not so pedestrian focused, they're not so interesting. So if you're comparing not old Europe that's been there for 800 years, 1,000 years, but really new Europe, right? Is there a difference then between how Americans approach space and how Europeans approach space? Are the values different, or is it really informed more by the history of these urban centers that we're talking about?
I think what is for sure different is everything is a little bit more small scale in Europe. So if we're talking about a residential project, it's 50 homes, 100 homes, right? If you're talking about a residential project here, it's 300 homes. So everything is a little bit more. It's smaller projects, smaller scaled, so that probably makes a difference in once a city or neighborhood is completed, how you would feel to it. But in any case, if you build new cities, the challenge is always to make it work, because it starts to work over time. If you get layering, if you've got one building, then there's the next new building to it 20, 30, 40 years later, then you start to rebuild one building, etc. These layers, these memories that are built into these buildings, into the squares, etc. That is when a city starts to come alive. If you build a brand new city, it's always a little bit dead. There's no green. The green needs to. It takes 20 years.
So what are the most important elements in building a new city? We're building a city from scratch, right? Either here or Europe. What are the 5 most important elements that you think about if you're planning that city or space?
Yeah, mixed functions. I think one of the big mistakes of modernism was to separate functions, right? Retail here, living there, working there. So that means you got like complete dead areas at night or during the day, right? So you need to mix functions. That also means that things that you need are at a walking distance, so you don't have to jump into the car. That's important. Integrate green and green spaces from day one. Can even be on the roofs. That's fine, right? Make double use of it, but start to integrate it from day one and not after the fact. I think, and try to create diversity in your buildings. So next to different program, try to create diversity in your buildings, high, low, long stretched, etc. And not just skyscraper city or not just these long 3-story high city blocks, whatever, right? So make it diverse, because that's going to help to create that layering and start to make it a little bit more interesting.
I think the Europeans have a more deeply communal nature, because they're used to living in such close packed cities for so many thousands of years. So I think the definitions of privacy are different. I think in the United States, one of the things I've learned working with you is, as we did some of the early projects, what I noticed in the approach, right, and we'll call it European approach or maybe Dutch approach in this context, was lots of transparency with windows, not a lot of setbacks between, say, somebody's living room window, and walk paths and things like that. And there's something in, like, at least in like the Dutch mindset, that's very comfortable with this transparency, whereas the Americans like to separate their public space and their private space. I'm not sure all the reasons for that. I think it's maybe that, again, getting back to, like, you guys have this history for thousands of years where you've had to live on top of each other. And the United States, the tradition has been much more like, go west, young man, and, go into, there's always more space in a sense. And I think that shapes how we use space and how we view private and public a little bit.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I mean, look, the Dutch are a little bit famous for, having hardly any curtains and everybody can look into your
Why is that? How come the Dutch have no curtains?
I don't know.
You don't know at all?
I close my curtains though, but I don't know. It's it probably, next to privacy, that's got to do with safety, right? So the feeling of safety and stuff like that. We are. Oh, why do we need key cards or stuff? We would just walk in. So that's probably a bit to it as well. But you're right. There's a big difference there, and we've had many of those conversations. Right, we try to create, and I think it helps in small spaces, big windows, get daylight in as much as we can. So even though they're compact spaces and they're efficient, right, they don't feel crampy and it feels spacious. And we make sure that we have, with sliding doors and stuff, we can connect, rooms to one another. You can walk around in a 450 square foot apartment, etc. So it feels spacious, it's functional, but it's not so much square footage altogether. And big windows help with creating a little bit more of that spacious feeling. Now, once it gets to the ground, right, you're right. I mean, sometimes we make too big windows or whatsoever, and it can help to make it a little bit more secluded or closed off from the street. But we do think it should not feel like a bank building, right? It should feel open and inviting.